can hear you great.
Amazing. Um, how have you been?
I've been pretty good. I'm enjoying season two. I think our listeners are as
Yeah,
well. Although the Civil War episode, some people had some comments, but in general, it seems like we're really building up this
definitely.
base.
And we're going to do World War II today, which is the big historic topic where if you look at the history buff community, um, like half of the people just study World War II um, because, like, the Byzantine Empire, no one actually, no, there are still some people who are into the Byzantine Empire. Ancient Assyria, no one studies. And even as recent stuff as the American Revolution, that pales in comparison to World War II in just sheer academic interest. And it's comparable to the Civil War, where everyone thinks they're an expert. And I am not an expert in World War II, but I do know more than most people in the population. And this video will in turn have lots of comments, mostly of people who have no idea what they're talking about. Because there are a handful of topics where there's this Dunning's Kruger. Like, for you as a person in tech, I bet crypto's comparable, where you run into people who think they know everything about crypto, and you'll think, that is the stupidest thing I have heard.
Yeah, I'll run into an Uber driver who claims to be a crypto expert, and I'm like, I don't know,
Yeah.
man.
And World War II is like that too, especially as it relates to the Holocaust, because everyone's got their theory about the Holocaust that they got from some YouTube playlist compilation um, that's cherry picking evidence. And every country has got its own narrative about World War II. But we're going to split this World War II into two videos. Today is going to be at the European theater, and I was going to push the Pacific theater out to next season, but I don't want to leave the audience on their seats for that long. So I'll really do the Pacific theater next week. Um, and let's
Sure.
get started with World War II.
Let's do it. I'm curious what people get
Yeah.
wrong, but you can weave that in later. So feel free to start wherever you want.
Okay. So we already did World War One, and you guys can watch that beforehand if you want to get some of the background for this conflict. But World War One was in many ways an anticlimactic war in that um, Europe built up a lot of tension, and not all of it got released in World War One, where Europe was still this mash of these very strong warring states that where one of them had to gain dominance over the other. Europe still had a lot of young people. And it's kind of sad to see that like Europe had the most advanced civilization in the world for centuries, and they just killed all those guys in the world wars, and then Europe stopped doing anything after the world wars. um, but life is life, things happen. And the every country that lost World War One fell into totalitarianism, and even countries that kind of won but they didn't win as hard as they wanted, it happened to them as well. So Japan and Italy won World War One, and they still fell to totalitarianism because they didn't win as hard as they wanted. And for Germany and Russia, both who lost the war, they all that happened to them too. And so Japan, Germany, and Italy turned fascist, and Russia turned communist. And World War One, it's kind of harder to know what actually started the war because it's all these centuries of European history building up. And for World War Two, it's much more easily about Hitler, where you don't think any country really, no one wanted World War Two, but the Germans wanted World War Two more than other people, where everyone else in the map would generally be happy to not have another major war. And Hitler another factor I've got to weave in here is that the post war period in Europe was economically horrible. We remember the 1920s as being an economic golden age in America, but that was largely off the backs of Europe, where America got a lot of the economic advantages for World War One. Well, for the entire 20-year period between the world wars, it was a horrifying economic period in Europe. So that built up a lot of tension and resentment. And we all know the Great Depression in the 1930s was also not a good economic time. And so people were kind of panicking. So authoritarianism was rising in a lot of countries. And even in the non-authoritarian countries like Britain or France or America, you had the rise of big government because people wanted to have some external force to help them through the hard times that they were living through. And with World War One and the end of that war, I heard an interesting, very intelligent thinker say that the problem with the treaty that the Allies foisted upon Germany with the end of World War One was that it wasn't hard enough and it wasn't soft enough. Because if they wanted to go really hard, you just dismember Germany into different countries, or you just destroy their ability to function as a country. You militarily occupy them. They didn't do that, but they also didn't let Germany off light, because with the Napoleonic Wars 100 years before, the entire rest of Europe agreed we're going to be pretty nice to France so France doesn't get resentful of us. And so Europe was peaceful for the century after the Napoleonic Wars due to that. But then Germany was given an absurd amount of debt that they had to pay off to the countries they lost the war to that they never could pay off. So the Germans hyperinflated their currency to just because if we hyperinflate the currency, that means it's easier to pay off the debt because just more money. And also, a major sticking point is the Allies forced Germany to sign that it was responsible for World War One, and that was deeply humiliating for the Germans because the Germans saw World War One as a bunch of countries surrounding them, and Germany saw itself as the victim in World War One, and over every war in history, every country will try to make themselves the victim in their narrative. Germany saw itself as the victim in World War II as well, which is insane because they were the one attacking everyone. But they saw themselves as like the victim of Jewish international conspiracies that forced them to have the war. Um, and and so Hitler rose to power in 1933 upon the political project. He shut down Germany's democracy, and Germany had become a democracy due to World War One, with the Allies forcing Germany to be a democracy. Hitler rose to power upon the manifesto of turning Germany into a hard right wing fascist state with the goal of colonizing and genociding Eastern Europe. And it's funny, you look over history and people are like, oh my God, how could we possibly know that the Taliban or the Soviet Union were bad? And Hitler, in his manifesto, literally said, I want to remove the Jews and the Slavs. And then he did it, and everyone was surprised. And so the German thinkers of that era, they saw the rise of big countries like China or America, not China yet, Russia or America or the British Empire. Because remember, in this time period, the British Empire owned India and Canada and a large part of Africa and Australia and that stuff. And Hitler said that Germany had never developed a serious colonial empire like that. And so it was Germany's duty, in order to survive in a world of continent-sized countries, to get their own continent. And so he wanted to conquer all of Eastern Europe, turn the native Slavic population, like the Poles or the Russians or the Ukrainians, into slaves or serf them, and then build it out as this German frontier, because Germany had this traumatic experience in World War One where they couldn't feed themselves and they were cut off of natural resources. And so the German thinkers and Hitler thought, we need to conquer all of Eastern Europe so that we won't have to rely on foreign trade, so we'll never have to starve in the same manner we did in World War One. And you can judge a really large amount of the decisions Germany made in World War II off avoiding what happened in World War One. And for example, Hitler didn't move to have a total war economy or have rationing until really late in the war, because the memory of the starvation in World War One was so bad that he purposely did everything he could to keep the German public from having to go back to that, but they eventually did. And the Germans were kind of pushing, because the English, the French, and the Polish were allies. And so the Germans were pushing up against the English and the French as much as they could before they had a war. And so the Czech Republic, as an example, or Czechoslovakia, as it was called back then, they had a large German minority. And over the previous like since the Middle Ages, Germans had settled across Eastern Europe. So you had German populations in Poland, in Ukraine, in Russia, in the Baltics, etc. And so you had these Germans spread around Eastern Europe. And with the breakdown of the Russian, Austrian, and German empires in World War One, that meant these Germans were stranded in these little countries. And so Hitler first unified Germany with Austria. And for those that don't know, Austria is culturally the same as Germany and ethnically the same as Germany. And Hitler himself was an Austrian. And then he wanted to take over the German ethnic areas in Czechoslovakia. And what happened was that the British and the French were really scarred by World War One, and so they did literally everything they could do to not have a war up to a certain point, and they were really coping pretty hard. Where, like Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, when he came back from the meeting with Germany over Czechoslovakia, he said, "Peace in our time." And they agreed, Germany, you can take these German speaking areas in Czechoslovakia and just leave the other Czechs, let them be independent. But Hitler didn't do that. Hitler took over the entire country. And um, we tend to think that totalitarian countries will honor their sides of the deal in the modern world, and they never do. But then Hitler's next goal was the conquest of Poland. And Poland is a much bigger country. And Poland was, there's this small area in northern Poland, like it's like 20 miles or something, touching the Baltic Sea. And then there's the free city of Danzig, where Danzig was an ethnically German city, but it was run by the League of Nations, or the earlier rendition of the UN. And then there was another part of Germany called East Prussia. And so there's this 20-mile gap between Polish territory, between the German regions. And so Hitler was pushing for the Poles, you need to give us this 20-mile gap so that we can unify the German peoples. And Poland said no. And then Hitler really wanted to conquer Poland because partly he viewed Poland as the entryway to his conquests of Eastern Europe, and he wanted to enslave the Poles and wipe them out. And so he invaded Poland thinking that the British and the French would back down because that's what they did for the Czech Republic. And it wasn't unreasonable for them to do that. In retrospect, after seeing what happened afterwards, if I was the British or the French prime minister, I would have let Hitler take Poland. But he made that decision, and then Hitler invaded Poland, and then Britain and France declared war on Germany. Do you have any questions before I could go on to the rest of the war?
No, this is a good
Yeah,
overview to start. I do want to return to what people get
yeah.
wrong at some point, but we're setting it up.
So Hitler took over Poland in less than a month because Poland was a pre-industrial society at that point. In Germany, and this is one of the things that people forget because we've gone through an entire phase as a society of Hitler derangement syndrome, of like, oh my God, the German people must have been so stupid to elect Hitler. Germany was the best educated country in the world at that point. It was one of the most technologically advanced. And that's what makes the tragedies of Hitler's Germany worse, because it shows that education, you can't remove the barbarity of the human condition through education, which a lot of people in our society would like to believe. And the thing that really shocked people is that the Soviet Union and the Nazis became allies at this point, because the Soviets and the Nazis divided up Poland. And the Soviets took the eastern third of the country, the Germans took the western two-thirds. And this was so shocking because Hitler's ideology was the conquest of the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, their ideology was hating Nazism, where they viewed as like Nazism as the ultimate extension of capitalism and reactionaryism. So these two ideologies crafted an alliance of convenience so that they could dismember Poland, a country that had done really nothing wrong. And so this was actually a big moment in the history of the global left, because the left realized, wait, Stalin is completely self-serving. He's going to cut a deal with the Nazis if it's strategically useful. And for the first 2 years of the war, the Russians and the Germans were allies, and Stalin was sending resources to Germany. And that meant that the Germans were stuck fighting a war in the West against the British and the French. And the Germans had pioneered a tactic called Blitzkrieg, which I think a lot of you know about. And Blitzkrieg is a German translation of lightning warfare. And there had been a military innovation since World War One, where in World War One the defense had a massive advantage, and so the and so you could just send millions of men to take a single mile, and guys with machine guns just wipe out the guys who were attacking. But the invention of the tank at the end of World War One had fundamentally changed warfare, since the tank meant you could drive over trenches, and tanks could survive getting hit by machine guns. And so the tank gave the offense the advantage. And the Germans, because they had lost the previous war, they had been forced to innovate and think about these changes in military technology, while the Western allies didn't have to. So the British and the French were stuck fighting the last war, while the Germans had invented new tactics. And so the Germans launched they launched the tank offensive with Blitzkrieg, and their goal was, and they succeeded at this, is they took over the country of Denmark in a 4-month period. And they took over the Netherlands in a single morning. So Blitzkrieg just allowed you to take over an entire geographic area immediately. And the German goal was, we want to conquer territory so quickly that their enemies can't even react against it. And so the Germans conquered Norway, Denmark, and the Netherlands instantaneously in a single strike. And then the French beforehand had built this thing called the Maginot Line. And the Maginot Line is this series of fortifications that protected the French border with the Germans, because the French had been fighting in the previous war where defense had been really paramount. And so if they were fighting World War One again, the Maginot Line would have completely protected the French against the Germans. But then what the Germans did instead, and people really have Hitler, and you asked me earlier, what are the things people get wrong about World War II? And one of the biggest things is that people have Hitler derangement syndrome, where people think a million ideas about Hitler, and they're constantly obsessing over Hitler himself as a person, and they're not thinking of the other elements of the war. And so some people say Hitler was a genius, other people say he was an idiot, and the truth is more complicated. There were a couple points where Hitler made really good calls that gave Germany a lot of strength, and there were parts where Hitler made really stupid calls. Hitler was a fundamentally intelligent person who was also very emotional. And so you could tell he was smart, but he would make decisions out of emotion that really had bad endpoints. But one of the very good decisions he made, and this inflated Hitler's ego for the rest of the war, is that on the Western Front, there's Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. Belgium's in the north, Luxembourg's in the middle. Hitler said, we're going to launch a tank attack through the Ardennes forest. And there's going to be another battle in the Ardennes by the end of this video, so keep these separate. We're going to launch a tank attack through the Ardennes forest, circle the French, and then attack them. And Hitler's generals, and Germany of that era had probably some of the best. They might have had the best leadership of any army ever. The German officer class, their generals were absolutely brilliant. And so that's how a big reason the Germans got so far in that war, even though they were surrounded on all sides. His general said no, but Hitler demanded that they go through the Ardennes, and they were able to wipe out the French army. And it's really remarkable in retrospect that, because if you look at the numbers side of this, and when I look at military geeks, the military geeks will often obsess over, this is the exact kind of plane we have, this is the amount of soldiers we have, this is the military budgets. But in a lot of cases, it's stuff like the specific circumstances, the leaders, the generals, the will to fight. And so France, by a lot of metrics, had a better military than Germany in the start of World War II. But the Germans just crushed the French army very, very quickly because their use of tactics was better. And the French were fighting too much of a cautious defensive campaign. And this is an advantage authoritarians have, where the democracies of World War II were scared to make aggressive moves or lose casualties, while the authoritarian governments were willing to be very aggressive. And there are strengths and weaknesses to each of those, because you'll see a couple really stupid, very aggressive decisions the authoritarian governments made. But France fell very quickly, and the French had kind of lost the will to fight from the previous war because France had lost so many men in World War One, and there was this big culture of pacifism that developed in France after World War One, where they're like, it doesn't really matter if the Germans conquer us; the Germans are people too, and that just turned out to be totally wrong. But the French got they got collapsed pretty quickly. And Charles de Gaulle was this random French officer who was in Syria, I think. I think he was either in Syria or in Gabon in Central Africa. He launched the French resistance, where there were a handful of French people who decided to keep fighting on in France's colonies. But most of the French immediately folded. And the big hero of World War One, Pétain, he he said we need to serve the Germans, because only by serving the Germans can France realize its potential as a country or some crap like that. And so the French immediately turned their loyalty to the German conquerors, and you saw the rise of the Vichy government, um, because the southern half of France was given this independent puppet state. And so you'll hear people talk about Vichy governments, and a Vichy government is a conquered puppet state. And the British were the only people who were still fighting left in Western Europe. And so for about a year, the war in Europe was just the Germans versus the British. And the British were surrounded, and the British had two really lucky breaks. The first is that the British Army in France, and Britain is an island country. Britain's never had a large military. They were stuck on the beaches at Dunkirk. And Hitler had a period where he could have just completely wiped out the British army if he wanted to, because the British were outnumbered, they were surrounded, and Hitler just didn't. We don't really know why. We don't have a good record for that. Hitler decided to not wipe out the British army, and and a bunch of random British ships got pulled together at the last second to save the British army and to bring it back to Britain. And this was a period of crisis in British leadership, where Neville Chamberlain, the previous prime minister, didn't want to continue the war. And then the choice was between Lord Halifax and Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill was elected. And most of you know who Winston Churchill is, but you don't know about his previous life, where Winston Churchill was one of the greatest badasses of his time period. He was an adventurer. He fought in World War One. He fought in wars in 6 countries. He was just an incredible guy. But Winston Churchill was actually a pariah in British politics because he was seen as too conservative and too aggressive. And Winston Churchill always said from the beginning, Hitler is an evil guy. We should stop him. But the rest of Britain was like, no, we don't want to fight that war. Churchill, you're just too aggro. And so if Churchill hadn't gotten into power then, Britain would have probably signed a peace treaty with the Nazis, and then the Nazis would run Europe. And so this is one of those turning points in history where you could easily make an alternate history. But the second lucky break, but as I was going to say, actually, if the British lost at Dunkirk, there's a solid shot they just sign a peace treaty and the war is over, because Britain can't make a new army. They don't have a big enough military industrial complex. But the British also wiped out the Italian and the French fleets at Taranto, or the British wiped out the Italian and the French fleets early in the war in just these really fluke, incredible victories. They wiped out the French fleet at Toulon and the Italian fleet at Taranto in secret strikes. And this was the time period where the British probably still had the best navy in the world. By the end of the war, the American Navy had grown much bigger and more powerful. But you can still see the British, for centuries beforehand, they had the best military, the best navy. So they were able to launch these naval victories that meant that the Germans in the Axis, the Axis or the Germans, Japanese, Italians, that they couldn't seize control of the Mediterranean. And Britain at this point was stuck. Britain, the Germans kind of had plans to invade Britain, but Britain's an island, and the Germans didn't really have a navy. So if they were going to attack Britain, it would take them years of preparation, of building up a fleet, and getting air superiority. And so there was the Battle of Britain, which has become famous in the English speaking world, where the Germans were bombing Britain a lot in 1941. I think it's spring 1941, because the Germans were trying to get air superiority, and the British were very narrowly able to stop the Germans from getting air superiority, and they and the British were going to give up, and the Germans pulled out like a week beforehand. So, but because they were going to attack Russia, and the big reason that Hitler never really took the conquest of Britain seriously is that for his whole time, his real goal was the conquest of Russia, and he viewed the British as fellow Aryans, and so his fantasy was to have the British help the Germans against the Russians, and that's actually not as unlikely as people think. And this is one of those absolutely bizarre things that was written out of the history books. But when Russia and Germany were allies, Russia attacked Finland. And the British were going to. Finland was this neutral country, and the Finns fought this absolutely incredible war, which is one of the most impressive things in history, because the Soviet Union had over 20 times as much population as the Finns. But the Finns kept on wiping out Russian armies. And Finland's not a big country, and you hear these crazy stories. Like one of the most impressive soldiers in history was this Finnish sharpshooter who killed 250 Russians personally. And so the Finns fought this incredible war against the Russians. And Britain and France, before the Germans conquered them, were actually going to declare war on Russia because of Finland. And you look at that and you think, that would have been one of the most stupendously stupid decisions in history, to fight Russia and Germany at the same time. But Hitler never really, and this is one of those places you see Hitler's emotional. Hitler didn't really take Britain as a serious threat because of his like emotional ideological views.
And do you think if he had, there would have been like something could have been
Yeah,
different?
I think Hitler could have won the war. And that's a controversial thing where a lot of people think the Nazis had no places where they could have won the war, but I think there definitely were. One is if he knocked out Britain early in the war, because if he never went after Russia and took down Britain, the Russians didn't want to fight the Germans, and so he could have had most of the European subcontinent. And if the Nazis won at the Battle of Moscow, which we're going to get to later, they would have won the war. And also, if they never declared war on America, they would have won the war. And so there are a handful of places where the Nazis could have won the war. And it's actually comparable to the US Civil War, where you have this faction where if it plays an aggressive game in the beginning, and it goes straight for the enemies, it could win the war. But once you get to later in the conflict, where it's Russia and America and these giant continent-sized countries, Germany is just going to lose. And so the introduction of America into the war is the point where just Germany's screwed. And Italy also gets involved in the war, and uh, Italy was under Mussolini, which was a fellow fascist dictator, but Italy was like not good at anything. Italy was just completely ineffectual, and so Mussolini's whole thing, and it's funny. Hitler used to idolize Mussolini, and that Hitler wanted to be Mussolini. And then, as Hitler rose to power, he realized he was vastly superior to Mussolini. So it's this kind of spurned admiration thing. And Mussolini's whole goal was to recreate the Roman Empire. And the Italian military was just incapable of doing anything. And Hitler, they tried to invade Greece. They failed. It's really hard to lose against pre-industrial Greece. And Italy was like a partly industrialized country. And so the Germans had to conquer the Balkans to help out the Italians who are losing in Greece. And it is insanely admirable to see when the Germans wanted to fight, how far they could get. Because the Germans conquered the entirety of the Balkans, which are not a small area. They're like 1,000 miles across in the matter of a few months. And the Germans also used paratroopers to take the island of Crete from the British, which was also one of the most cool military operations ever because the ability to take over an entire island just with paratroopers, that's insanely difficult. But also, in this time period, all of Africa was a European colony. And the western part of North Africa, the Maghreb, was a French colony, but that became a colony of the Vichy Nazi puppet. Libya was an Italian colony, and Egypt was a British colony. And so there was this strange campaign in North Africa that probably should never have happened, but it spawned all these myths. In one of the books I read in World War II, Little Heart's History, he writes like 200 pages in the North Africa campaign, which is insane. But for the British, it was the one place they won against the Germans. So the British loved talking about the North Africa campaign. And it's funny, Hitler never wanted to fight in North Africa. He saw it as useless to the Aryan race. But he dropped Rommel in this small German army in North Africa. And they nearly beat the British. And there was this battle at Al Alamein in Egypt between a German, a British, and Italian army, where if the Nazis had probably put some more pressure, they could have conquered Egypt and taken the Suez Canal. But that was another front where this is basically just side quests. Hitler didn't care about that area, and the British and the Italians. It's remarkable to look at that war because there were points where small British armies of 20,000 men would capture Italian armies 4 times their size because the Italians cared that little. And yeah, my father's a baby boomer, and he would say even when he was growing up, they would make jokes about how useless the Italian army was. Like how many, the Italian tank has 1 gear for going forward and 3 gears for going backwards. But to get back to the rest of the war, the Germans had this big plan of starving out Britain, where Britain was dependent upon foreign food, mostly from the Americas. So the Germans couldn't compete with the British in an actual naval level, but they could with submarines. And so there was this period called the Battle of the Atlantic, which was the Germans getting all these submarines to destroy enough traffic of food to Britain so that Britain would starve. And that also they did really well. Again, there's all these campaigns in World War II where I'm surprised the Germans fought so well, considering their numeric disadvantages. But it failed once the Americans got involved in the war. But if you study Europe in World War II, the vast bulk of the war is on the Eastern Front. You could view literally everything except the Eastern Front as a side theater, and that's not really how Americans study the war. In that we tend to view our involvement in the war as by far the most important thing. But the reality is that half of the deaths in the war were just among Russians, and 80% of the German military was fighting the Russians. And there are battles where like 2 million people per battle died. And so it's really hard to overstate the importance of the Eastern Front. And Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22nd, 1941. And Stalin was caught off guard. And for those who don't know the rest of history, Stalin is a really nice guy. And Stalin is a very naive person too, where Stalin killed millions of people while he was very paranoid of Stalin was paranoid of everyone except Hitler. And so Stalin took it completely for granted that Hitler wouldn't betray him and declare war on the Soviet Union, even though, I hate to repeat this, Hitler's literal manifesto was based around the conquest of the Soviet Union. And so the first couple months of Operation Barbarossa, or the German invasion of Russia, are pretty embarrassing for the Russians because beforehand Stalin had killed off 80% of the Russian officer class, And in war, the leadership among the officers is one of the most important things. And so Russia was just incapable of having any effective leadership because Stalin killed all the officers. And Russia was also in a process of industrialization. And so in the first couple months of Operation Barbarossa, the Germans could kill 3 Russians for every casualty they'd take. And the Russians were just losing a lot of territory. And there's this interesting map that I saw that the distance from the borderland between Germany and Russia to Moscow is 1,000 miles, or it's more than 1,000 miles. It's the distance from New Jersey to Kansas City. And the Germans nearly made it that distance, or the distance the Germans penetrated into Russia is equivalent from New Jersey to Kansas City, which is just insane. But Russia is really just that big a country that you can do that. And congrats, you still have 10,000 miles left to go to conquer the rest of Russia. And and so Hitler thought that the conquest of Russia would be easy and the conquest of France would be hard because that was what happened in World War One. But in World War Two, Russia had spent 20 years industrializing, so the Russians became a much more tough country. And the Soviets, even though they had a tremendous amount of flaws, they created a social structure that made the Russians fought with fanatical courage. Partly because if they didn't, they'd get shot, but they still fought with fanatical courage. Unlike World War One, where past a certain point, the Russians just gave up. And Hitler thought that he could conquer all of Russia in 6 months, which is a big miscalculation. So many invaders of Russia think. With Napoleon being an easier example, who a lot of you guys would know about. But within 6 months of the invasion, they got to the edges of Moscow. And I personally believe that if the Germans won at the Battle of Moscow, they would have won the war. And the a Russian spy changed the course in history, where the Russians had a spy in Japan, and the Japanese and the Russians had fought some battles a couple years earlier that we'll talk about in the next video in the Pacific theater. But the Russians were always worried the Japanese would attack Siberia, while the Germans were attacking the Russians in the West. That would be a perfectly rational thing for the Japanese to do, but the Japanese were too busy planning their attack on the Americans. And so this spy in Tokyo told the Soviets that they could move these troops from Siberia and Russia's possessions on the Chinese border back west. And those Siberian regiments came in at exactly the right time to stop the Germans from taking Moscow. And so the Russians were able to narrowly hold on to their capital at Moscow as winter set in. And every time the winter hit, the Germans did worse because the Germans weren't prepared for how awful the Russian winter would be, and it allowed the Russians to fight on their home turf. And something to keep in mind is that Moscow is at the latitude of Alberta. It's at the latitude and has a climate similar to like the interior areas of Canada. So that's not fun to fight in. But the war in the East became a meat grinder, and the Germans tried to launch an attack next spring towards the south of Russia in the Caucasus, where the Russians kept their oil deposits. And that they approached up in the city of Stalingrad, and Stalingrad was not a particularly important city, but it was on the Volga River, which is the marker between the Asian part of Russia and the European part. And it is pretty crazy that the Germans got within 100 miles of Kazakhstan. And Stalingrad became the bloodiest battle in history. And by the way, World War II is by far the bloodiest war in history. It is at 65 million deaths. The nearest war in bloodiness is something like Genghis Khan at 40 million, or the Taiping Rebellion at 30 million. And so the Stalingrad, just millions of men were stuck in Stalingrad, and the Germans tried to take the city, but the Russians fought heroically to hold on to it. And then there was Operation Uranus, where the Russian commander surrounded the German army and over the winter strangled them to death. And so the Germans lost an entire army at the Battle of Stalingrad. And Stalingrad is again another point where the Germans could have won the war. But then for the entire rest of the war, the Germans were fighting on the defensive. And the Eastern Front has so many threads, and I'd recommend you watch Dan Carlin's podcast, which is for free, on Ghosts of the Ostfront. He spends like 10 hours on the Eastern Front of, maybe probably more than that, on the Eastern Front of World War II. And it's just stunningly brutal. And you'll hear stories about the Soviets creating a bridge out of the frozen corpses of Nazi soldiers. And the Nazis had a thing called the Hunger Plan, which is they would just steal food and starve the entire population of Eastern Europe. And just the brutality of the Eastern Front in World War II is something that I don't think is a parallel ever in human history. It's just horrifying. And this is by two totalitarian societies that view human life with complete contempt. Both the Nazis and the Soviets thought there was no intrinsic value to the human soul, and that it was the state's role just to kill people to reach a utopia. And over the next couple of years, the Russians gradually grounds the Germans back east. And there are very few big set piece battles. Kursk is one of them, which was the Germans were planning on re-attacking the Russians in the east. And that was the biggest tank battle in history, which the Russians won. But after Stalingrad, the Germans lost a lot of their best men, and they lost an edge over the Russians. And so the Russians pushed them back. And one of the most important turning points happened at this section in early 1942, where the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And the Japanese and the Germans were allies, but they didn't really do anything because they're on other sides of the earth. And Hitler declared war on America, which is one of the most profoundly stupid decisions in history, because America was the most industrially powerful country in Europe. I think it probably had more people than all of Western Europe combined. And it was a very wealthy country. And Hitler called America a nation of shopkeepers. And he just viewed the Americans as a mongrel mixed race, which lessened their blood. And when he meant that, he meant like Germans and English and Irish mixing, which would produce a worse combination. Um, and, and so America didn't want to fight Germany, partly because there were a lot of German Americans, but also the Republicans who dominated Congress were the isolationist party, so they didn't want to have a war with Germany. But by declaring war on America, Hitler got America into the war. And once Stalingrad is lost, and once America is involved in the war, which roughly happened within a couple months of each other, Germany is just done, and they can't win the war. And so America's in the war. America cleans up the Atlantic Ocean with the Battle of the Atlantic. And America's manufacturing is just insane in this war. You can look at the statistics for how much stuff America made, and it's just absolutely, it's remarkable. Where there were a couple things like in certain kinds of weaponry or trucks where America made more material than every other country in the war combined. And America sent a tremendous amount of its goods to Russia to help them out. And the Americans first attacked North Africa, which was the weakest German possession, and starting in Morocco with the Americans and the British, and then pushing from Egypt, the Americans took North Africa. And Hitler made this really emotional decision of stranding this army of 250,000 men in Tunisia that the Americans just took as prisoners. And then the Americans started fighting their way up Italy, where it was this really slog grinding campaign because Italy's a long peninsula where it's hard to take. It's mountainous too, and so the Americans would continually have naval landings behind German lines to push themselves up Italy. But that took years, and the so I'm skipping over a lot of stuff. The Russians are pushing the Germans back west in Eastern Europe. The Americans are pushing up Italy. And in 1944, the Americans launched the attack at D-Day, which is one of the most famous battles in American history, where they spent 2 years organizing this naval operation to attack an army from Britain to France. And so tens of thousands of soldiers attacked France on June 6th, 1944, and they gradually create a toehold where the Americans reconquered France after a couple months. And so by the time you're getting to the end of 1944, the Germans just they don't have any they're just run out of guys and they're being attacked on three separate fronts. And so the Germans just go into free fall as the Allies push their way across all of Europe. And now and there's a couple of things I'm going to throw in here. Italy changed sides once the Americans attacked Italy. Mussolini switched sides, and the Germans captured Mussolini and then reconquered Italy. And also, the Americans and the British had these giant bombing raids of Western Europe, where, ironically, and this is a fact people don't know, the German manufacturing peaked towards the end of the war because the Germans had been ramping up their manufacturing tremendously. But the Americans and the British had these giant bombing raids upon German manufacturing, which are a really remarkable scale, but at the same time, they're evidence that show that. And this is a big thing you see in military philosophy. People massively overvalue the importance of aerial bombing. But the Germans also attacked the Americans at the Battle of the Bulge, which is their attempt to drive the Americans out of France, but that totally failed. And then you get to the point where the Americans and the Russians are dividing up Europe, and they were scrambling, and neither side really liked each other. They became allies out of convenience because of the shared enemy. And so towards the end of the war, the Russians split. The Russians and Americans split Germany in half, and Italy, Western Europe becomes part of the American bloc, and the eastern part of Europe is taken by the Russians. And the Russians commit absolutely horrifying atrocities. Like the eastern third of Germany, they just kick all the Germans out. Areas in modern Poland and Russia, they just kick the Germans out, move them to modern Germany, and bring in Polish and Russian settlers. The Russians move all the ethnicities. In Eastern Europe, or a lot of them, like 200 miles west. And then the Russians find that the Germans have been committing the Holocaust. And so they'd enter these camps in Eastern Europe and find that 6 million Jews had been killed by Hitler. And Hitler had viewed the Jews as the great thing that made Germany lose World War I. So he wanted to take revenge. And the Holocaust got kicked up into overdrive when the Germans knew they would lose the war because they viewed it as the most positive contribution they could do to world history. And so Hitler was diverting resources towards the Jews, which he really should have been towards fighting the war. And so that was one of the worst atrocities in history. And so the Germans killed about 12 million people, half of that Jews, the rest of which combination of gypsies, homosexuals, Poles. Poland lost out a quarter of its population. And yeah, that's my summary of World War II.
Insane.
Yeah, it is very sad. It's like 60 million, 40 million people died in Europe, 20 million die in Asia.
Oh,
Yeah.
and I know we'll get to the Asia stuff in another episode. Is there anything we haven't gotten to that you think is
So you
important
requested for
before
me
we
to talk about
please?
what people get wrong about the war. And a lot of it is people conflate the Holocaust too much with the war. And people also have Holocaust derangement syndrome, where they'll look for all these various theories about, because the World War II was not about the Holocaust. It was more so about Hitler's imperialist ambitions to conquer Eastern Europe. But it's definitely a thread in there. And people will try to look at the evidence in a weird way, but like the evidence we have for the Holocaust is pretty airtight. We have confessions that the Nazis did it. We have records of the Germans and Americans finding these camps. You just have like 6 million Jews that are demographically gone. Um, and so people really obsess over the Holocaust, even though it's an era of history that we have tremendously good records on. And also, uh, once we get to next episode, we'll talk about Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Asian theater. That's a big thing. And people also, they have Hitler derangement syndrome, where they obsess over World War II is still a very emotional event. And so if you look at the Mongols 800 years ago, people can be pretty rational about Genghis Khan because he lived a long time ago in a land far, far away. And World War II, people are still alive who remembered living it. I knew my grandpa for like 15 years who fought in World War II. Um, and he just died a couple years ago. And so it's still in living memory. And people have Hitler derangement syndrome where they obsess over, oh my God, what was Hitler doing? And people just have a lot of emotions that are kind of misplaced, where people are very emotionally invested in the idea that Germany never could have won the war. And there is a rational debate that goes on here, but I think Germany could have won. Um, and there are also conspiracy theories that like FDR, and we're getting to the Pacific Theater here, that FDR forcibly got America into the war, but people will like read one book on the topic and then, or just not read any books, and then believe whatever theory they have about the war with complete certainty.
The is it worth to that end? Any other books you think people
Yeah.
should read?
So keep in mind that my background's in anthropology, and so I'm going to recommend a lot of books that are the sociological effects of World War II, which I don't think we didn't really have the time to get to today, but there's a lot of the social effects of World War II. So the World War II by John Keegan, that's considered World War II by John Keegan is considered to be the best history of World War II. I haven't read it yet, though. I have read Little Heart's history. That's not very good. This book is a good history of World War II. Martin Gilbert's The Second World War II, or The Second World War, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. Everyone tells me that this book is absolutely incredible. It's the best history of Nazi Germany. Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder. That's also really good, and that's a history of the logic for why Hitler and Stalin committed the atrocities on the Eastern Front. Um, Dictators by Richard Overy. This is the book on the sociology of Hitler and Stalin. And Tragedy and Hope is on the it's a history, it's the best history of the 20th century, and it goes into a lot of details about the historical and broad macro perspective things that resulted in World War II, and also World War II's effects on the world on a civilizational basis.
Well, that's maybe a great place
Yeah,
to wrap. Then we've got a good cliffhanger for the next episode in
sure
season
thing.
three. But I thought this was a great
Yes,
start.
sounds
Great job.
good. Thanks for having me.